All right, thank you everyone for coming here. As mentioned, today my speech is going to be about reference accessibility in demonstrative choice. And let me just preface this to everyone. Today's speech is going to be very interactive and a lot of interaction with how we perceive the surrounding world. So first of all, let me just say thanks for everyone for being here, and SEALS conveners and especially the volunteers here for helping us out and organizing this massive events. And so the big picture, first of all, I will talk Vietnamese demonstrative particles, and then the second is the existing two ways that we've been using to explain demonstrative choice, and then I'll try to pitch in the kind of a third way, which is accessibility. And then I'll try to prove this third way with data, and then lastly, end with a conclusion. So first of all, the Vietnamese demonstratives. What are demonstratives in general, right? So demonstratives are things that we frequently use in our daily conversation, like English this and that, right? And the basic function of demonstratives is set to kind of identify and locate referent in the world and in conversation. And it is often associated with distance. Like, for example, this refers to something near, and that kind of refers to something far away. When you look into any studies or descriptions of Vietnamese demonstratives, you will notice that there seems to be two types of demonstrative. The first one is a standard one, and the second one is more, I call it a strange one. So for the standard one, they're generally agreed upon by everyone, what they do, what their function are. So they are set to kind of convey the near far distinction similar to this and that in English. There's like a few differences, like some demonstratives, like this last one is more used for time, and some grammatical differences, like some of these stuff can be used in pronouns, but some are not. But those are minor differences. But then there's the strange demonstratives, and generally referred to by Vietnamese scholars as tiểu từ or particles. Scholars agree that they are the sign of fluency, but there's not really like general agreement as to why does it do so. And my study will mainly focus on these kind of strange demonstratives and explain their usage. So these particles are said to come from, grammaticalized from standard demonstratives. And perhaps a very long time ago, because now they have a very distinctive form, distribution, and even function in discourse. Like for instance, with form, the particles are quite different from the standard one. They have many phonological changes. You can see monophthongization in the first one. In the second one, see level tone here turns to a low tone, and this is very special. You see onset deletion, vowel centralization, and even in some cases, you see the deletion of the entire syllable, and you only see what's left is the tone. So it's completely cliticized. With distributions, particles only found at the end of a sentence or an utterance. So for example, in the sentence here, this grape is delicious, đó. The standard proximal này is at nominal, but the particle one can only be found at the end of a sentence. So previous literature suggests that they kind of expressed stance, like for example, with this one, the particle đó indicates that the speaker is pretty sure that these grapes are delicious because, well, you know, they might have tasted those grapes. But here's the problem. There's no general agreement as to why do these particles function this way, and there's even less understanding about their exophoric usage. Because you can see here, they can refer to things in the world. If they're not distance, if they're not manner, but they still refer to things in the world, then what is it referring to? Right? As you can see in this one, the speaker is just referring to the past portion of far, and you can still see this proximal particle there at the end. Right. So when we try to explain these demonstrative, there's potentially two ways to explain. The first one is the distance approach, and the second one is the social interactive approach. So with the first one, is a more familiar one. Spatial distinction is said to be like the driving force for demonstrative choice. And we have seen this in a lot of classic studies on demonstratives, and even in grammars, and especially in studies on Vietnamese demonstratives. And so the second one said that distance is not the core meaning. It's not a driving factor. Instead, it's the social, interactive purposes. And this approach really emphasized the role of interaction. So one prominent studies is Enfield 2003 on loud demonstratives. So in this one, Enfield found that demonstratives do not align with distance, but it's more about location in this here space. So the here space is like an interactive field. Like for example, when we talk to each other, we have this interactional space, and everything within the space is proximal, but anything outside is distal. But the thing is, explaining demonstrative particles is quite difficult when we just use these two. Let me illustrate this with the following two examples. So going back to this one, the participants are looking for some pandan leaves to cook in the distance. The speaker finds the camera, and then he now pointed us to us audience, especially. All right. And this one, in this example, is still the same speaker, but in different context. He then told us something that he found in the distance again. So when we put those together, we see that what the speaker tries to do in those two examples are identical, exactly the same. It refers to something far away in the distance. But as you can see, the main difference is this. One has a proximal there, but the other one has a distal dom. What's going on, right? So at this point, it seems like distance is not really the factor that drives demonstrative choice. And it makes even less sense if we try to use interactional space, right? Because if we graph these two examples, we see that they have the same interactional space. The addressee and the speakers stand next to each other and all point at something in the distance. And it's still in this space. So why do we see distal? And why do we see proximal in one case? So the goal of my study is to understand the reason why do we see this inconsistency Vietnamese. What I do here is try to put forward a third approach, which I refer to as accessibility, right? So this concept does not really pick side or oppose any of the previous approaches, but it's actually an extension or a combination of both approaches. So it borrows the emphasis on bodily experience in the distance, and it borrows the emphasis on intersubjectivity, multiple perspective, and interaction from the social approach. So the general basis of this approach is that speakers constantly pay attention to how references are accessible to their addressee. And the second thing is that accessibility is reflected in demonstrative particles choice. So I visualize this with this graph right here. So the goal of the study is really try to understand which particle, which demonstrative do we use when reference is accessible and when it is not accessible. But before answering that question, let me explain to you what do I mean by accessible, right? So accessibility is the ease with which references come to mind, and I use this framework by Kahneman, 2003, and to my understanding so far, has only been used in a Dutch demonstrative study by Kiewit et al. So Kahneman suggests that there are two factors that determine accessibility. The first is salience, and the second is selective attention. So salience is the characteristics of the feature that affects our registration of the reference, like size, color. Right? And the more salient a reference is, the more easy we can register it. So an example of this would be here. Salience could be the size or the distance of the reference. So here we see distance coming into play as well. But with selective attention, you can think of it as like a focused attention or a concentration upon the reference. And this can overcome the original salience. Something of low salience with proper or adequate selective attention can become high salience. And we can see selective attention like this. This is being provided by the speaker's pointing finger in camera direction, establish this selective attention upon the referent. So data used for the study is a corpus of 98 minutes of audiovisual recordings from spontaneous conversations, and these are pulled from YouTube videos, the whole spontaneous data. So let's take a look at those two examples that I presented earlier. So consider the salience of the panda bush. Right? In the first frame, it has low salience. Well, it's really too far away. There's too many greeneries in the background. You don't really know what you're looking at. But in the third frame, it has a higher salience because you now see it closer, and the unrelated greeneries were kind of removed. But why do we see that increase in salience? Right? Well, because there's a selective attention established upon it. We see the camera zooming in, and then the speaker even repositioned his finger so that it is now on top of the panda bush. Right. And with these two things, we can see that in the first frame, the reference was inaccessible, but in the third frame, it has become accessible. And then we see the proximal. And then in the second example, in the first frame, it has low salience. We know the marsh is too far away. We don't really know what part of the marsh to look at. Are we looking at the water? Are we looking at this patch of grass right here or land? But in the third frame, it's still low salience, still too far away. We don't really know what to look at. The reason why it remains low is because there's really no selective attention upon it. There's no zooming in, there's no gesture. And when we put them together, we see that the referent remains inaccessible throughout this entire referring event. So the observation so far is that proximal particles are used when referents are accessible, and distal are used when referents are not accessible to the addressee. And this approach actually allows us to better explain how Vietnamese particles function in discourse. So let's examine how proximal NA is being used here. In this one, the speaker behind camera is showing us some dishes, and this is our targeted referent called meat, like stir-fry meat. Right? Okay. Again, see how the target referent is presented to us. And the first frame was low salience because it was not in focus. But in the second frame, it now became salient. It's now become accessible. And so again, we see the proximal. So the advantage of this accessibility framework is that it helps us describe the entire referring event. Why speakers use gestures, basically. What does referent look like before and after the gestures? When we look at previous approaches like social, right? Well, it works very well with explaining why do we see proximal being used at one particular point in the entire referring activity, but it does not necessarily capture what happens in the beginning, or what did the speaker do throughout this entire referring events, like shifting the camera, like why do we even do that, right? So the other advantage is that it allows us to explain references that are not even in the surrounding context very easily. For example, memory, hypothetical situations. For example, this one, we see how a referent in past memory is referred to. In this example, the man on the screen talked about where he used to sleep 20 years ago. So the targeted reference is this row of bed in green here. Let's see how it plays out. Right. So even though the beds were exclusive knowledge, it became accessible to the addressee via this gesture. It's like, oh, there's a bed right here. And this is the reason why proximal was used. And with distals, you find it when the proposition is inaccessible, and what are the places where we can find inaccessible these, right? So assertion, interrogation, negation, and warning, explanation. So in each of these, I'll give you an example, but I will happily go more into it after the presentation if you have any questions. So let's look at this one. This assertion, you see this distal particle đó at the end of an assertion. I confirm that he is my younger brother, đó. And then in interrogation, we see that the answer, right, the inaccessible information for the person asked is now marked with the distal, right? Is it crab's eggs? Yes, it is crab eggs, đó. And negation. Well, negation, when we give the right answer, we think that, okay, this information is inaccessible to you, which is why I'm giving it to you. So again, inaccessible, about 20 meters, đó, distal. Next one, warning. Inaccessible because that person might not know about it. That's why he's walking very dangerously. It's slippery, đó. And this one, very extensive. I can go on and on about this one. But this is a modologic sequence where you have new information given about the first mention of the referent, and all of the new information is marked again with this distal part. But it is important to know that accessibility is not an unbreakable rule, right? Because breaking this rule is how we introduce new functions to these particles. And let's examine this through one following example. So in this one, the woman in orange and the man in white are talking about a mysterious homeless man next to them. And she's claiming that he is her relative. The way let's see how she does so. Right. So the target proposition is his front teeth is as big as mine. This is illustrated by the gesture, right? The woman first pointed to the homeless man's teeth and pointed to her. So this proposition, it's clearly accessible to the addressee. Everyone can see it, even from the gestures as well. Why do we see this though? Đó, which is marked for inaccessible. So this conflict occurs very frequently across speakers, across various contexts. And so it must have a meaning. And what I proposed here was that the speakers kind of manipulate the accessibility of the referent for their own gains. So first of all, by marking accessible as inaccessible, information is now marked as new and exclusive. So it means that now the speaker becomes the distributor of knowledge. And when the speaker becomes the distributor of knowledge, they gain authority and credibility. And when they do so, this is what linguists have been pointing to: stance marker, information structure marker, epistemic strategy. And it's kind of similar, very, very, very familiar to us. And what the case when inaccessible is marked as accessible, right? In this example, the speaker behind the camera is going to introduce to us a new speaker, but she's not here yet. She's there, but she's not here. Let's see. We see the reference is being marked with a proximal. But the utterance was finished even before she was shown to the addressee. So it means that when the proposition was being uttered, it was not accessible. So why do we see inaccessible referent being marked by an accessible particle? So when we do so, it's trying to say that, oh, it's not, but it will be accessible soon, don't worry. So it kind of builds up anticipation and sets up the scene. And I'll say that it's kind of similar to what we have in English with the cataphoric usage. Like yesterday, I met this guy. We don't know who this guy is, but is being referred to with the proximal. So in summary, for this presentation, I have proposed accessibility as a way to investigate demonstrative system of a language. And this approach really built on previous approaches of distance and social. And accessible is marked with proximal and inaccessible as distal. But more importantly, is really shows us how important gesture is towards demonstrative choice, because it can turn something inaccessible to accessible. And the last part that we saw is that accessibility is something that can be manipulated. When something accessible manipulated into inaccessible, we see stuff arise like stance marker or information structure marker. When something inaccessible marked as accessible, we see stuff like scene setting or cataphoric usages. And this point also marks the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.